Hello, I'm Nick Herriman, author of The Entangled State. Welcome to 25 Concepts in Anthropology. Today we're going to talk about structure and agency. Now, the question I'd like to ask is, can you think or act originally or creatively? For example, when you're driving home or writing a song, are you acting creatively by, if you're driving home, taking another route or using a shortcut that not many people use? Or if you're writing a song, are you being creative? Or are your thoughts and actions in writing a song or driving home determined by culture and society? Well, when you're driving home, of course you can choose which route you'll take, but it's a limited amount of choices, which is set by basically the roads that are available. Moreover, you have to drive on the right side, on the correct side of the road. You have to indicate, etc., etc. And when you're writing a song, you have to use you'll typically use a certain scale, a pentatonic scale, or a Western major or minor scale, and a typical kind of rhythm, syncopated or 4/4 or whatever it might be. So, on the one hand, we can see there is some creativity in the way we drive home or write a song. In other words, on the other hand, we can see there's almost no creativity, that it's determined. And these kinds of debates over whether our actions are determined by society and culture or whether we can act relatively free of them are the debate about structure and agency. The structural point of view is anthropologists who adhere to a structural perspective will say that our thoughts and actions are determined by culture and society. Those who adhere more to an agency perspective will say, no, we can act relatively free of them. Okay, why this is important is that it points to a paradox in human life. You can't drive home unless everybody obeys the road rules, more or less. In other words, if the roads were free for all, and anybody could drive wherever they want, however they want, you'd never get home. You'd crash and die before you got 500 meters. So the structure of roads and road rules allows you to get home, but it also limits the way you can get home. There are only a certain finite number of ways that you can get home in your car, legally at least. So this is the paradox. We need structures in order to have our lives, to have action, to have a culture, but these structures also limit us. They enable action and they also, limit action. So what are the kinds of structures that we could talk about? We could talk about economic structure. One is of boss and worker. That's the way capitalist production from about 1800 was organized. There's a boss who owns the means of production, and there's a worker who works on that means of production. And the terms that Marx would use would be bourgeoisie and proletarian. In the feudal society, Marx would say it's lord and serf or peasant. In medieval Europe, you also had masters and apprentices. In contemporary universities, you have professors and students. And these are all what you call dyads. In other words, there are two terms, boss and worker, lord and serf, master and apprentice, professor and students. And which one of these is empowered? Which one's the powerful one? Well, in each case, it's the first one. The boss, the lord, the master, the professor has certain powers. And anthropology has typically been interested in those who are in the margins or who are disempowered. So it's very important to us to study structures. So there's economic structures. There are also social structures. For example, in contemporary Australia, there is a distinction between rural and urban. In rural areas, raw materials are produced, and in urban areas, raw materials are consumed. There are divisions between young and old, certain expectations of behaviour from young people, and certain rights for young people, and certain expectations and rights for old people. There are also classes in Australia. We have upper class and lower class. Let's enlarge this, upper and lower class. What else do we have? We also have certain other kinds of structures like organizations, sports clubs and so on. And the sports club, as you probably realize, is quite a recent invention of the late 1800s, etc. There are also religious organizations which have an older provenance, religious orgs. Okay, they're social structures. Other ones are, for example, gender. In contemporary Australia, we have male and female. There are also so-called, you could say, racial ones, white versus black or Latinos. Also religious, Christians versus Jews. Not so important now, that last one, but more important in early modern Europe up until the 1940s. I've already discovered class. Perhaps the idea of lower and upper is too simplistic, but there are more complicated and complex ways of looking at it. And if you're in America, you can devalue somebody by referring to them as being upper, as lower class, for example, as white trash or a hick or that kind of stuff. So most of those examples, not all, most of those examples were dyadic. In other words, there was one or just boss worker. There is two terms. Organizations are not an example of a dyadic relationship, though. And there are many more examples of more complex relationships than these. For example, in Java, you used to have three kinds of religious streams, if you like. There was the aristocratic stream, let's say the merchant stream, and the peasant stream. Okay, so there's some examples of social structures. There are also ideological structures, and these are things that the structuralists are very interested in. And the idea here is that not only the economy has structures, and not only our society has structures, but also ideology, the way we think, is structured. For example, dark and light are very important dyadic, or we could call binary structure. For you say somebody kept you in the dark, that's a bad thing. I've seen the light is a good thing. So this is an example in language. And the way we talk about, for example, women, if you see a report on a conference, the reporter might refer to the clothes a woman was wearing, but never to the clothes a man was wearing, because typically the idea is women are there to appear and men are there to do things. So dark light, female, male, appearing and doing, these are examples of what we call binary structures. And the idea is that our thought is structured in these ways. So these examples are binaries. The idea is they structure the way we think. Delete that now. Okay. Other kinds of structures, these are from research in Southeast Asia, between the court areas, as in the court where the king and the sultan live, and peasants who are illiterate, indigenous religions and world religions, great traditions, these are written traditions, and little traditions, these are oral traditions. These are other kinds of structures that you might see referred to in the literature. So that's the general idea about structure. These structures enable human organization. They enable relationships. We could think of them as patterns or order, or a form of order, which characterizes our economy, our society, and our thought. Nevertheless, we need to have some sorts of agency to make sense of this. We need to have some sort of action that is relatively free of structure. In other words, humans must have created these structures. In other words, there is no structure without agency. You need agents to create structures. Most commonly, this occurs in revolutionary periods. During revolutions, agents create new sets of structures. For example, in the French Revolution, the structure of feudal lord and peasant was replaced by a structure of modern national state and citizen. And revolutionary agents, if you like, created these new structures. So anthropologists are very interested in structures and agencies, and we talk about it as a debate, the structure-agency debate. I'll give you a couple of examples which you could use it. One is in relation to prostitution and striptease. Now, from one example, you can see prostitutes as or strippers as victims, especially if they're female prostitutes, female strippers. We'll see them as victims of a patriarchal, that is a male-centered culture. We'll see them as having very few choices. They end up in prostitution, if it's, say, 1940s, the USA or Australia, because they have very few other options. If their husbands died, they have no other legitimate way of making income. Make the 1930s Australia or the US. And we could see this in relation to strippers too. On the other hand, other researchers, other anthropologists doing research might argue, well, they get to play with sexual norms, they get to tease men, they are free of having a husband, these kinds of things. So anthropologists will debate how much their actions are structured and how much their actions are, the term is agentive, which is a bit too pretentious. I'll write it down anyway just in case you want to know. Agentive, structured or agentive. In other words, are they characteristic of social structures, or are they characteristic of agencies? Another one I'm just thinking about because I read an article on it recently, Filipinos selling organs on the international black market for body parts. On the one hand, you could see their actions as structured. These are poor people who are marginalized in the process of modernization, so they have very few options. On the other hand, they're very keen to sell their organs. No one's forcing them to do it. So you could also see it as agency. So the structure agency debate could be related to that one in philosophy called the free will versus determinism argument. Free will just argues, can we act freely, or are all our actions determined? Anthropologists have a more specific focus, of course. We're only interested in cultural anthropologists are only interested in social and cultural structures which structure the way we think and behave. But all anthropologists are aware that agency is important. What we can't agree on when we look at any phenomenon is to what extent the action is structured, or to what extent people involved in this action are demonstrating agency. Okay, thank you for your attention. This is probably one of the more difficult concepts in anthropology, so if you're having difficulty with it, please, you could send me an email and I'll give you some further ideas to follow up. And you can see a few more of these, the idea explored a bit in my book, The Entangled State. So thanks very much for your attention.